You're listening to Heroes of Healthcare, a series about the bold, selfless, and innovative individuals who are serving our communities with compassion and care. This episode is sponsored by Jackson & Coker Locum Tenens. If you are seeking interim physician or advanced practitioner coverage at your facility, or are a practitioner who is looking for more work-life balance, visit them at jacksonandcoker.com to learn more about their services. Now, let's get into the show.
Welcome to another episode of Heroes of Healthcare. On today's episode, we have a very special guest, Dr. Andrew Wilner. Dr. Wilner is a published author of 4 separate books, as well as the host of the Art of Medicine podcast that now has over 100 episodes. Dr. Wilner is a neurologist by trade and has spent his career working locums in addition to his permanent work. On this episode, we take a dive into his podcast, as well as chat about locum tenens and why a physician should give it a shot. We hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Wilner.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I'd love to kick off today's discussion with talking about your podcast, The Art of Medicine. It now has over 100 episodes. So can you let us know a little bit about how this podcast came to be and what types of topics and guests you have?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on the podcast. And locum tenens is one of my favorite topics. And also, we'll start with the podcast. You know, I just interviewed a physician, Dr. Sussman, who wrote a book called The Art of Medicine. So right away, he contacted me, he said, I got to be on your podcast because your podcast, which I've been doing for 4 years, is The Art of Medicine with Dr. Andrew Wilner. So what's that all about? Well, I think, you know, as much as we like to use science, and I am a scientist, I believe that medicine is an art, and whether it comes to telling a patient difficult news at the bedside or making a diagnosis or just, you know, figuring out what to do, medicine has always been an art. And also I'm interested in the arts, music, dance, and of course, creative writing. I've been a writer all my life. I have 4 books, and I'm always looking for creative outlets. For many years, I've worked also as a medical journalist, writing medical news. And as technology evolved, that turned into interviews like this. It used to be there wasn't enough bandwidth to actually do a video. Most of you listening probably can't remember those days. But now, you know, we got Zoom, and it's easy to do videos. So it dawned on me that I could interview people who I thought were doing important and interesting work that probably wasn't going to make the front page of the New York Times. It's been my observation that there are so many people doing hard, important work, whether it's spending several years to write a novel or doing medical mission work, or working with hospitals to create better, administration so that patient care improves. And most of it kind of goes, unrecognized. I said, well, maybe I could have these people on my show and talk about what they're doing and why it's important and why they're investing so much of their time. So about 4 years ago, I started with a topic. I've been working locum tenens also as part of my work-life balance scheme all the way back to 1982. So I interviewed a locum tenens staffing agent to try and give the lowdown for physicians and other healthcare providers who are interested in, what's this locum tenens thing? Well, that first episode now has over 1,000 downloads. It's been very, very popular. So every few episodes, I do one on locum tenens. I've had the privilege of interviewing the president of NALTO, the National Association of Locum Tenens Organizations. And of course, Olivia and your colleague Tanika were on my show very recently to talk about what is NALTO trying to do to assist locum tenens physicians in the workplace so that the whole system continues to flow. There's government regulations, there's credentialing, there are a lot of obstacles in any sort of project that kind of get in the way, and sometimes you need to work hard to smooth things out. I've also had a couple of CPAs who work, one who works only with physicians who do locums. His name is Ben Nanny. That's his clientele, only physicians who do locum. So what does that tell you? That tells you when you prepare your tax return, if you're a locum tenens physician, that there's very specific considerations that you're going to have when you do your taxes. So much so that there's actually an accountant who does only.
Especially this time of year, it's, people are starting to get their, this time of year is when they're going to receive all of their tax paperwork. So going back and finding the art of medicine, if you're a locum tenens physician, and searching for Ben's episode would be very useful this time of year.
Right. I'll also mention Jaron Dana is a CPA who works with physicians who does locum, so that I think it's hard to do everything by yourself. Numbers was never my favorite thing. So I do rely on an accountant to help me get it right, because I didn't know the difference between 1099 and W-2 for a long time. And if you don't know the difference, go find an accountant right away, because that's something you need to know.
Exactly.
I'll just add that my favorite people to interview are physicians who are writing books, nonfiction and fiction books. And I put their books on my website, which is andrewwilner.com. And there's a section called Library. And I've read most of those books, and they're all great books. And so if you're looking for a fun book to read, go to the library section and you'll see books that are interest to doctors. Some are fiction, some are nonfiction, some are kind of business related, but they're fun. But these are all the products of the people that I've interviewed. So The Art of Medicine has been a fun project. Comes out every 2 weeks and as a podcast.
I certainly enjoyed being on, and I really just admire everyone that you're highlighting and that you're taking time out of your busy schedule to do just this selfless work of art. One of the things that's always intrigued me about physicians, and you mentioned that you have always been in the arts as well and really been fascinated with the arts. And I feel like, and this could be wrong, but I feel like many physicians have that in common. They have this creative outlet, whether it be music or writing or, dance or whatever it is, that seems to another piece of their life that they pair with medicine. Is that true, or why do I feel that that's so common amongst physicians?
Oh, I think it's true, and I think it's really true of most everyone. Given an opportunity, I'm going to interview next week an orthopedic surgeon who illustrated his own textbook on the spine. And it's for patients. It's like, well, you have back pain. Let me show you what the spine. And so he drew the images, himself. He's an artist. Yeah, I think, pursuing an art, well, it does require discipline, right? There's the training, and then there's the interest, and then there's the prioritization. And if you have friends who are artists, whether they're actors or dancers, and they're doing it, you'll know that they are disciplined when it comes to their work. And if you talk to them, well, why do you do that? In fact, my father used to ask me all the time, why are you writing this stuff? I've written hundreds of news articles and essays and commentaries, and they're hard. They take time. He says, why do you do that? You don't have to do that. You could never understand why I would take the time to do work, because it is work, that I didn't have to do. So I had to think about that. And it's like, well, I talked to a very famous writer years and years ago who was well known in the community, and I had an opportunity to interview him. I was only in high school, and I said, isn't writing hard? He says, oh yeah, it's terribly hard. He said, I'm miserable when I'm writing. And I said, so why do you do it? He goes, well, because I'm more miserable when I'm not writing.
Good answer.
And I think if you're an artist, you'll identify with that. It's just something that you need to do, kind of like eating and sleeping. And it's like, I need to draw a picture. I need to get out there and dance. That's what my body wants to do. I need to think about this. And of course, I think most people, including me, I think much more clearly when I'm writing something down. If I write it all out, it's like, oh, as opposed to some big, jumbled mess in my head. I don't know. Once I write it down, everything sort of becomes a lot more clear. Yeah, I think many physicians have these interests, and unfortunately, medicine has grown in such a way with more bureaucratic demands, whether it's filing your tax return and all the ins and outs, or administrative requirements, or credentialing requirements, signing off forms at work. All of a sudden, there's a lot of this non-creative, busy work. Meeting guidelines, and that's a problem, because that cuts into your. I think most physicians, including myself, feel an obligation to prioritize their job. Right? If you're a physician, and I see a patient, I want to feel that I have 100% confidence in giving that patient the best up-to-date knowledge regarding their condition. And it's a lot of work to keep up, and I do that. So if my free time is sucked up by bureaucratic challenges, there's not a lot of time to sort of paint a picture or write a novel. So I think that is a big challenge for today's physicians.
Yeah, well, I think that talking about this creative expression is really great. It's really great for us to kind of change into this next subject that also talks about creative expression. And you mentioned creative writing. You're the author of 4 books, but one of your most well-known books that continues to be purchased often is called The Locum Life, A Physician's Guide to Locum Tenens. Can you tell us a little bit about when you wrote that book and what inspired you to get that story out?
Yeah, well, I just so happen to have a copy.
It's the illustration on the front is wonderful.
Yes, well, in fact, I'm not an artist, but I designed that illustration. And then I found an artist to actually execute it, because I think it illustrates when you are a locum tenens physician, you literally parachute into a new environment, a hospital that needs you, or a clinic that needs you because they're growing, or someone's gone on leave or maternity leave, or someone's died, or they're expanding. But they need you. They need you a lot, and you just show up and kind of like a Navy SEAL, kind of go on your mission. Yeah, so the book, well, I started, as I mentioned earlier, I started doing locums back in 1982, so I could write a book, and I would have some work-life balance. And I've used locums off and on over the last 40 years. I traveled pretty extensively in Southeast Asia, and then would come back and work locums, and then go back to Southeast Asia to write. I had a little studio there to write, and also to scuba dive, which is one of my passions. And I guess it must be about 7 years ago, I was thinking, okay, I want to focus on a topic. I want to write something. What do I know something about? Because that's the first, when you're a young author, it's very hard. It's like, well, what am I going to write about? What do I know? You're 17 years old, you're a kid. So part of writing is writing about something or something you're willing to learn about. And locums does have quite a few challenges: credentialing, picking a staffing agent or not using a staffing agency, and malpractice, and compensation. How do I figure that out? And then we talked earlier about taxes, and versus a permanent job. Gee, don't I need a permanent job? So I had kind of worked through all of these more than once. And I thought, gee, locum is something I know about. And maybe I ought to share this. So I started, it took several years actually to put it all together. And it was a fun project. And of course, you learn a lot. And I interviewed quite a few other locums physicians. So it wouldn't just be my take. And then a lot of experts, one expert on credentialing, for example, who kind of told me from their side why it's so important. So the locums book, it came out several years ago. Then as another project, I thought, well, I need an audio book. So I looked into how do you do an audio book. And by that time I had set up a little home studio for doing interviews like this. And I realized I could just do it myself. So I learned all the ins and outs about how do you make a perfect recording, because, they won't accept your audiobook unless it can't be too loud, it can't be too soft, it has to be all consistent. And there's a computer that decides all that. So you have to use some software to make it happen. And so I did the audiobook myself. It was a lot of fun. It's 6 hours and 45 minutes of listening to me, if ever you want to listen to the audiobook. But it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
That's great. Well, I think that so many of us, we're so busy that even if we love to sit down and actually turn the pages of a piece of paper or read on our Kindle, the time isn't always available. So I'm so grateful you did the audiobook, because it's going to reach so many more people than it might be able to, who just don't have time to sit down without distractions and read. This way they can listen while they're driving in the car, or, while they're cooking a meal for their family, whatever might be happening, and listen in.
Yeah. In fact, I've started listening to audiobooks myself. I have a 35-minute commute. And it's like, okay, I don't have too much time to read on an average day. So I'll, put the traffic to good use.
Yes. Well, in Locum Tenens, so I read a study recently about how popular it's becoming year over year. Locum Tenens is something that wasn't that well known. And I'm sure when you first started in Locum Tenens, not too many physicians were doing it. But now it's becoming much more common for people just coming out of school. They're using it as a way to learn about different areas or different size health systems, just kind of broaden their experience before signing a permanent role. How have you seen locums change over the years, and what are the benefits of being a locums provider?
Yes, well, it has changed, and it's a little disconcerting that I've lived long enough to see a pretty long evolution. And, it used to be locum tenens was the doctors that did locum tenens were the doctors who couldn't get a good job. Nobody would hire them, so they would just fill in here and there. Well, that is all gone. Now locum tenens is very competitive, and there are many, many more physicians who are doing it. And there's a lot of reasons for it that have just happened. And a lot of them aren't particularly sort of positive changes in our system. I would say, so imagine, 30 years ago, you're a physician. Well, what did you do? You started a practice in a community that you liked, often where you grew up or someplace you wanted to live. You built relationships with your friends and your colleagues, so they would respect you. And then, of course, they would refer patients to you, and you might buy an office building, maybe get a few partners, and you would run your practice. That was the model that I grew up in. I think it was 2016 where, for the first time ever in the history of the world, more than 50% of physicians were employed. Well, when you're an employee, the world is very, very different than when you're the owner of your own practice. Because if you're the owner of your practice, you have employees that you have to pay. You probably don't take much vacation time, because when you take vacation, there's no more income coming into the practice to pay your employees, to pay the mortgage on your building. Everything stops. So that's why doctors, one of the reasons, don't take much in the old days, would rarely. Plus, they also felt, I remember many, many physicians felt an ethical obligation to be available to their patients 24/7. I can't go to Paris for a week. What's going to happen to Mrs. Jones and Mr. Smith? They're congestive heart failure, needs monitoring. It was a much more personal relationship. Well, when you're an employee, you can pick up and move. You're not abandoning your patients, because they're not really your patients. They belong to the hospital system or the insurance sort of network. I remember I was in private practice for a while, and at sort of the end of that phase, whenever I got a new patient, I would always ask, "Oh, so who referred you to me?" And, it was always kind of a small congratulations to myself that someone had thought highly enough of me to send me their very difficult patient. And I wanted to know who that referring physician was. Well, towards the end of that phase, the answer I usually got, oh, my insurance changed. I was very happy with my other doctor, but, now I have Cigna before I have Blue Cross, and you're not, and they weren't Cigna, so I had to come to you. It's like, oh, well, that's not very flattering. Plus, it created a lot of work because I had to start from the beginning. What's your history and all your past, which the other doctor knew well. So it was very counterproductive. I had to sort of just reinvent the wheel for this patient because their insurance had changed. And so once physicians became employees, all of a sudden they're mobile. The guy who owns his own practice, in a suburb, he's not mobile. But once you're an employee, it's like the other thing that happened is sort of a fidelity to employees. It used to be an employee contract is 5 years, and you really couldn't be let go unless you'd done something, illegal. Now, contract says 90-day notice for any reason. That's the typical physician contract, 90-day notice. You can give 90-day notice or they can give 90-day notice. Well, that doesn't really create loyalty. So if I see a better job, in the next town, here's my 90-day notice, And so locums isn't really that different than most permanent positions.
It's a 30-day notice typically. So
it's a 30-day notice. So, if you look at 30 versus 5 years, well, hey, that's a big difference. Plus equity in a system. Well, most employed physicians don't have any equity in the system. They're just showing up, they're day laborers, basically, showing up as an employees. So there's the concept of shift work, which when I grew up didn't exist. As if you were responsible for your patient, while they were in the hospital for every minute of every day. Now it's like, well, I'm here 7 to 7. Everything that happens after 7, that's the next guy. So there's been a big change in sort of the worldview of how physicians kind of see their patients. And so to go from that kind of permanent position to a locums position, it's not that big a jump. And of course, we haven't talked yet, and it's kind of hard to have one of these conversations without talking about, burnout. A lot of employed physicians are not happy with where they are. Administrators who are usually not physicians are telling them what to do, how many patients to see, where they need to sit, hiring staff to help them who may not be the staff that physician would choose given the choice, but has no choice because he's an employee just like the staff, getting very little special recognition for all the years of study and so on versus, any other employee who really doesn't have the same background. So there's sort of an equalization, which isn't necessarily bad, but it can grate when you see things that aren't going the way they should and things are being run by someone who, in your view, could do a whole lot better. So locums is a way to preserve your identity and your career as a healer and be happy about it because you're going to work, right, where you want to work and when you want to work. And there are many physicians I've talked to that work locums and say, oh, Dr. Wilner, I love medicine so much more now because, I'm working 4 days a week or I'm working 9 out of 12 months a year and I just take more time off and I'm so much happier. I just love it when I come back, which isn't the way they felt when they were overburdened and, pajama time, charting at night and just trying to keep up. There's another phrase I've heard, you can love the hospital, but the hospital doesn't love you back. And that is often the case. And it is a shame. And the other tragedy is, and I've worked very closely with a few physician leaders who are helping physicians choose non-clinical positions. Being a physician doesn't necessarily mean you have to see patients all day. There are many, many other physician jobs in the pharmaceutical industry, in the insurance industry. And in the CDC, the FDA, I mean, there's actually a very, very long list. Even venture capitalists, they need physicians to help them kind of do a financial assessment about, new companies and are they good investments? I mean, there's really a lot. But I think the tragedy is that physicians are really being driven out of clinical medicine, which is where their hearts were to do these other jobs.
Exactly. Well, for those physicians out there whose heart it still is being with the patients, I think one of the reasons they might be uncomfortable with the idea of doing locum tenens is that continuity of patient care. Kind of what you mentioned, wanting, having that heart to be able to see the patient from start to finish. And with locums, you rarely have that opportunity. You might jump in with a patient in the middle of a case or at the very beginning and then not know what happens. What would be your response to that, or to a physician who is worried about missing out on that full patient life cycle?
Well, I would say that in general, that full patient life cycle doesn't exist anymore, even with permanent jobs, because of shift work and the way medicine is practiced today. That continuity often doesn't exist anyway. And it does in terms of, particularly for, like, I'm a neurohospitalist. Most of my work is neurohospitalist. So, the average hospital stay, nationally is about 4.5 days. So that doesn't give you a lot of continuity. We do have some people that come back, and I've seen that happen. And in my clinic, I have some continuity. I have a permanent position right now, and we could talk about how that happened. But the other thing is locum tenens jobs can last a year or more. So you can have plenty of continuity even in a locum tenens position. And then a lot of locums work isn't really based on continuity. You have anesthesiologists, you have surgeons. They don't really have a lot of long-term continuity. But I say it's very hard, even in a permanent position now, to find that job where you're going to stay for 30 years and really have that sort of continuity where, oh yeah, I delivered you and now I'm seeing you have a baby. That's sort of Marcus Welby kind of stuff. In a few places, maybe. Yeah, so in my case, I worked locums off and on for years so that I could pursue my other passions and these other things I needed to do, like writing. And then, circumstances change. And in my book, I talk about the 3 kind of categories of people that do locums. As you mentioned earlier, there's the newly graduated. Okay, hey, I'm a new physician now. What do I do? And maybe not ready to sign, a contract with a group practice or a hospital. Maybe I've always wanted to, live in Hawaii. So you can go do a locums for 6 months in Hawaii and see if it's like, whoa, Hawaii is kind of far. And, the reality of being in a place, I looked at Hawaii when I first graduated, and, Hawaii is beautiful, but it's pretty isolated. You can't just jump off. It's a 6-hour flight to LA. Just go to a meeting or, the interaction, you're really isolated, which is, it's the half full, half empty. That's the beautiful part. But, for a young physician, I'm not sure I'd recommend, being that isolated. But everyone, is different. Also, a lot of young physicians have a significant other who may be a year ahead or a year behind. So a year of locums allows them to catch up so that now they can both move together. So that's also a very practical way. Mid-career physicians, they've worked 10, 15 years. They're good at what they do. They like it. They're in a little bit of a rut. Maybe they want to try something different. Maybe they need some extra money, for the kids' tuition or braces, work on a vacation. And then there's pre-retirement. There's physicians who are 60, 65. They're going strong. Everything's great. But the practice they're in is requiring 60 hours a week. And they don't want to do 60 hours a week. They like to do 40 hours a week, and spend a 3-day weekend and go visit the grandkids. But a lot of private practice does not have that kind of, and academic practice doesn't give that flexibility. You're sort of all in or you're not. Being a physician is professional. It's like NFL. You can't play the NFL. Oh, I'm not going to play this game. I'll play in 2 weeks. You can't do that, right? You're either all in or you're not playing. So locums doesn't make that requirement. Locum says, you know what you're doing. You're a well-trained physician. You tell us what your work schedule is going to be, and we'll find a position that works for you. So it's like, hey, that sounds pretty good. So for me, as I did locums, the other thing it does is it allows you to explore different kind of work settings. I worked, for example, before I had my current job at the Mayo Clinic as a locums. I had residents, I had students, I worked in the clinic, I worked in the inpatient service, I worked on the stroke service. I got a lot of experience with the way Mayo Clinic works. I worked at Hennepin County Hospital, which is a big teaching center. I had students, I had residents, but I was a locums. I was there for like 6 months, and they asked me back. I was there for like another 6 months. I said, I kind of like this environment. So I started looking for a permanent position because my personal situation had changed. I had just gotten married, and I wanted to settle down and wanted to have children. So it's like, I don't want to be flying here, flying there, flying here. It eats up a lot of time. It's fun to fly. This was all pre-COVID. It wasn't a big deal, but I wanted to find a permanent job. I looked for 2 years, and I interviewed at several places, all of which were very, very good jobs that if I didn't have locums, I probably would have taken. But because I had locums, as a backup, and I was happy with locums, if the job wasn't perfect, it's like, okay. It's like, no, one job, for example, they said, oh, we don't want you doing any academic work. This is just clinical care. And I said, well, I kind of like doing academic work. Keeps me sharp. I like to contribute. I like to teach. That's part of what, who I am. They said, well, it's a waste of time. We don't want you doing that. You need to be seeing more patients. And they had a great salary, great compensation, great place to live, nice hospital. I said, well, no thanks. So that went on for 2 years. And then I stumbled on this position where I am now, where I do clinical work and I do academic work and I teach and I make the schedule. So I can have days like today where I'm at my home office and I can do my work. I can work on my podcast. I'm writing a couple case reports now. And it's the work-life balance that I was looking for that locums gave me enough experience to figure out. And I'm very happy with this position. Of course, I do have that 90-day clause.
Yeah, you have the 90 day if something else were to come up. And we often don't mention this on Heroes of Healthcare, but we're sponsored by Jackson and Coker, which is a Locum Tenens agency. So I live in the locum space and am very familiar with it. One of the things that you mentioned, and I know we're coming short on time, but you mentioned the mid-career folks who do this, sometimes for supplemental income. I was talking to a physician recently who has a wonderful job at Kaiser in California, and goes to rural hospitals on occasion. And it's really her way because she loves to teach and loves to give back. And she's able to go to these rural hospitals and teach them the ways of a big health system, as well as learn some of the things that these smaller health systems might be trying out that she could possibly bring back to her large health system. So it's also a way, as you mentioned, to keep those skills sharp, but then also just give back in ways that maybe you wouldn't be able to at your health system, and just kind of make sure that you're staying on the cutting edge of any new technologies, or just kind of forcing yourself to think outside the box as happens whenever we're in a permanent job or in the same structure for a certain amount of time.
Oh, yeah. I think getting out of the box is very important. And sometimes you realize when you go to a locum somewhere, you say, boy, I'm so glad I have my job. It's a lot better than that one. And then you come back to work with a big smile on your face. So it can work either way. But getting out of the box, I think, is very healthy from time to time.
Well, I am just so impressed with everything you've been able to accomplish throughout your 40-year career as a neurologist, but also an author. Now you have the Art of Medicine podcast. So the Art of Medicine podcast can be found on all podcast platforms. And then as far as the Locum Life book that you have, along with 3 others, where is the best place for our listeners to go and purchase those if they would like to learn more?
Oh, probably right to my website, andrewwilner.com, andrewwilner.com. And, or you can just go directly to Amazon. There aren't too many Andrew Wilners, so it ought to pop right up.
Wonderful. Well, it has been such a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for diving deeper into the art of medicine, as well as what it's like to be a locum physician, the pros, the cons, and maybe why someone should try it out. Before we leave, we always like to ask who your hero is. So can you share with us who your hero is, healthcare or otherwise?
Oh, well, I think I have many, and I don't have a prepared answer to this question, but I think the first thing that comes to mind as someone who helped me in many, many ways that I didn't even realize all my life would be my father.
That's wonderful. Well, we appreciate you sharing that with us, and we would love to have you back on the show. I appreciate being on your show, and I look forward to continuing to work together. We can partner together on our podcast.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Heroes of Healthcare. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell a friend or leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You can also visit us at www.heroesofhealthcarepodcast.com for more information or to listen to past episodes. Thanks again to our sponsor, Jackson & Coker Locum Tenens, providing interim physicians and advanced practice staff for over 40 years.